Welcome to video 3 in the online legal research series. In this video, we will look at finding legislation. From the library page in MySCU, navigate to the library subject guides, expand the law heading, and open the legal research skills guide. Click the legislation page on the left-hand side. Here you will find links to the government legislation pages at the top of the screen. I generally recommend using the government legislation databases as they provide the authoritative and current legislation. They are easiest to use when you already know the name of the legislation you are looking for. Remember that you will often find references to the key legislation when you first begin your legal research looking at secondary sources. Watch video 1 in this series for more help finding secondary sources. At the bottom of the legislation page is a Finding Legislation tutorial. This provides an introduction to finding legislation, including using the parliamentary and government legislation databases. Rather than repeat the information from the tutorial, in this video I will show you 2 different databases you can use for finding legislation. We will look at the subscription database Law 1 and the free database OSLI. The first task I will demonstrate is finding legislation on a topic. I'll open the legislation on a topic page from the left-hand side, and I'll open Law 1. Law 1 is one of the databases that allows you to easily browse for legislation on a topic. From the home page, click Browse at the top of the screen. Select a jurisdiction. Commonwealth is selected by default. You can also select all jurisdictions. Then on the left-hand side under Legislation, look for the By Subject heading. I'm interested in finding current legislation, so I'll click the Current link. You can browse the list of subject headings on the left-hand side and expand them using the plus symbols to view more specific subheadings. In this series of videos, we have been looking at examples relating to contract law and express terms. Let's now expand this to look at how contract law interacts with consumer rights. I'll expand the Consumer Protection and Competition Law heading, and then click Consumer Protection Fair Trading. The list of legislation relating to this area is displayed on the right-hand side. There is a lot of legislation in this subject area, so I'm going to narrow this down further by clicking Show Filters at the top of the list. Firstly, I want to limit my search to only the principal legislation. For this task, I do not need to look at the amending legislation, as the changes will have been incorporated into the current principal version of legislation. I could narrow it even further by ticking the box next to Act. Click Apply to apply your filters. From this shorter list, the first principal act in the results is the Competition and Consumer Act. To view the Act, click the title. The top of the page provides information about the currency for this legislation, and underneath is the table of contents, which I can click through to start reading the legislation. I can also navigate using the table of contents on the left-hand side of the screen. One of the features of Law 1 is the Key Info button, which you will find at the top right of each legislation homepage. Key Info provides links to historical versions of the legislation, commencement and amendment information, as well as the original bill and explanatory memorandum. The Key Info button is useful to get quick links to key documents, but it is not necessarily comprehensive. And so again, I recommend using the Government Legislation database once you start looking at legislation in detail. From the Key Info button, you can easily access this Act on the government site by clicking the View Original Source link at the top. This is the Competition and Consumer Act on the Federal Register of Legislation. Let's now look at legislation in OSLI. Again, from the Legislation on a Topic page, I'm just going to open the link for OSLI. And remember, on each page of the Legal Research Skills Guide, you will find instructions and screenshots to help you navigate each of the legal databases. OSLI contains a huge amount of information, so to use it well, spend some time thinking about the type of information you need to find. If you know the type of legal information you are searching for, you will be able to browse or limit your searches to the right section of OSLI, which will save you time. It is possible to search for full text legislation in OSLI, but be aware that you will probably find hundreds or even thousands of results. This is because in OSLI, each section of an act or regulation is a separate document. I'll demonstrate. I'm going to click the little arrow on the left-hand side of the search box and go to Advanced Search. I can click Boolean Query to use advanced search operators to narrow my search. I'll just search for the phrase consumer law. So that found nearly 13,000 results. I'll go back to the search page and demonstrate a better approach. Instead of searching all of the OSLI databases, I can click Show All and then select a specific collection within OSLI to search within. First, untick all of the databases and then scroll through until you find the specific type of information you are looking for. In this search, I'm interested in finding Commonwealth Consolidated Acts. So I'll just tick the box next to that heading and run the search again. Now I only have 124 results. On this results page, you can see that many of the results are to specific sections, most from the Competition and Consumer Act. I'll open up this one for section 140K. So this is just the text of one section of the Competition and Consumer Act. On the right-hand side, I can print just this section, or I can download the entire Act in RTF format. This is a large Act, so it's available in 4 parts. I can also click the Note Up References link, which is my favourite feature of OSLI, and we looked at Note Up for cases in video 2. Clicking Note Up for legislation runs a search for references to that section across all of the other content in OSLI. That includes cases that may have cited the section, secondary sources like journal articles, as well as other legislation. When you are looking at an individual section of an Act in OSLI, remember to always consider the section in the context of the whole Act. To do this, navigate to the home page of the Act by clicking Table of Provisions at the top right. It's important to consider legislation holistically. An individual section will be contained within a part, a division, a subdivision, and so on. You need to consider the Act as a whole, including at the top, the object of the Act, as well as any interpretation or definition provisions. Back on the page for section 140K, there's a reference here to the Australian Consumer Law and it's hyperlinked. That's because Australian Consumer Law is a defined term in the Competition and Consumer Act, and the hyperlinking of defined terms is another handy feature of OSLI. If I click Australian Consumer Law, I get taken to section 130, Definitions, in which Australian Consumer Law is referred to in the context of Schedule 2. To find Schedule 2, I'll first need to navigate back to the Table of Provisions on the right-hand side. The schedules will be at the very end of the Act. I'll scroll all the way to the bottom of the Act, and there is the link to Schedule 2, the Australian Consumer Law. It is relatively unusual for substantive legislation to be included in the Schedule to an Act. However, the Competition and Consumer Act is one example of this. Schedule 2 is very long, so to navigate it, OSLI has provided a handy linked table of contents at the top, from where I can now browse the different sections of Schedule 2. I could also simply do a Control F search across the text of the page. For example, perhaps looking at the misleading and deceptive conduct concept. So I'll just do Control F and type mislead, and then I can click through the results. Part 2.1 is all about misleading and deceptive conduct, and Section 18 is titled Misleading or Deceptive Conduct. But remember, consider the Act as a whole. So if you keep clicking through, you will notice that there are other parts and sections of the Act about the concept of misleading. For example, misleading representations about goods or services may also be relevant to the facts of your case. Now, because the Australian Consumer Law is contained within a schedule, there is no note-up link for the sections within Schedule 2. Another important aspect of researching legislation is checking for currency. Legislation can be frequently amended, so you need to consider whether you need to view the legislation at a particular point in time, for example, as it was at the time an incident occurred, or whether you need to look at the legislation as it currently reads. In OSLI, check the currency of legislation by clicking the Notes link at the top right of a section homepage. The Notes page will tell you the compilation number, date, and the most recent amending act that has been incorporated. Scrolling down the notes page, you will reach the endnotes. The endnotes include the legislation history table, which lists all of the other amending acts that have changed the Competition and Consumer Act over time. And there is also an endnote for amendment history, and this provides section-level history for the Act. The information on the notes page gives you a fuller view of the Act and how it has changed over time. The next step when researching legislation is looking at secondary and extrinsic materials, which will help you interpret the legislation. And that is the subject of the next video.